Hello everyone, and welcome to this podcast. In this podcast we're going to cover some of the basic material from chapter 1. At the beginning of this chapter, the authors bring up a question of what is life? We know if we see a dog or a cat, we clearly know that that's a life, and it's a living organism, and we've known that for a very long time. We also know if we look at a glass full of sand that itself is not alive. But what is it that makes something alive or not alive? I'm going to talk about 8 different properties that we like to say all living things have. The first is order. Your book shows when you look at any given life form, you can see that it has a very precise order. If you look at a human, I'll just draw a stick figure here, but when you look at a human, there's a lot of order to it. There's a lot of symmetry to this person. There's a right half and a left half. Each half of the body looks very similar to the other half. Your book describes it by looking at a sunflower. And you'll learn throughout the semester that my artistic skills are pretty horrible, but they work. A flower that you look at has amazing order, particularly when you start looking at it at very close up. So life has order to it. Living structures have order. The next thing we should look at is regulation. Your book shows a picture of a rabbit, and the blood flow through this rabbit is precisely regulated, in part to help maintain the temperature for this rabbit. We can think of regulation as regulating various processes in a living. It may be regulating the temperature, the pH, anything that helps that organism sustain life. The third thing we should look at is energy processing. Later in the semester we'll spend a lot of time talking about energy processing. I'll just abbreviate it here. Energy processing. And we can think of this as kind of that flow of energy. So what do I mean by energy processing? Well, let's take a step back and think about where all energy begins. All energy begins from the sun. And I apologize for the kind of juvenile shape here of the sun, but it'll work for our purposes. And energy that comes from the sun will reach Earth, and when it reaches the Earth, various plants, I'll just draw some grass here, it's going to take that sun and it's going to convert that into energy. My abbreviation for energy is just an E with a lightning bolt here, so you may see that periodically throughout the semester. This grass generates energy using the energy from the sun. So that's processing energy. Some animal now will come along and eat this grass. As I warned you, I'm not a very good drawer, so let's just draw kind of a generic animal here. I'm not exactly sure what kind of animal it is, but it's some kind of animal that eats grass. Once this animal here consumes the grass, it needs to process that energy obtained from the grass into usable energy that it can use to do work. So the glucose it gets from the grass now has to be processed in this animal. So that's energy processing in a nutshell. I'm going to erase this so we can look at some of the other characteristics of life. So the next thing I want to talk about is evolutionary adaptation. This kind of gets at the question of why do organisms live in certain places, why do they look certain ways, and that's because they have adapted to those environments or those special niches. So your book gives a pretty good example of the seahorse living in coral. Luckily for you, I'm not going to attempt to draw this, but I will explain it. Certain organisms, like the seahorse, have adapted to their natural surroundings. A seahorse, particularly in the picture that you're looking at, has more of a reddish pink color to it, which matches the coral. This helps protect that seahorse from predators. If that seahorse happened to be bright blue, it would be easy prey for any kind of predator that might eat seahorses. So the genetic modifications that have allowed the seahorse to be reddish pink have been favored throughout evolution to allow it to survive in the coral and escape predation. The next thing I want to talk about is reproduction. We can think of reproduction in a simpler form where you have a cell that divides and forms two new cells. And we'll talk more about this, but it's a process known as mitosis. So that is cellular reproduction, taking one cell, creating two new cells. Multicellular organisms also reproduce. So for instance, if you had two humans, when they reproduce, they will produce progeny. And this would be true of any animal or plant or other multicellular organisms that undergo sexual reproduction. So something that is living has to have a way to reproduce, if it's a single cell or if it's a whole organism. Reproduction at the cellular or whole organism level is essential for life. The sixth thing here is a response to the environment. Your book provides an example of the Venus flytrap. It responds to the environment by having prey land on it, and then the Venus flytrap plant consuming that prey. But responding to the environment can come in many other kinds of ways as well. For instance, shivering would be a response to the environment. Birds migrating, they're responding to the environment. So the ability to respond to the environment and act based upon that response is critical for life. The next one here is growth and development. So your book gives an example of a plant growing from a seed and how that plant started off as a seed, and through various genetic pathways it knows to form the plant. So that's a clear example of development. You can think of animal development the same way, where you start off life, I'll draw it over here, as a single cell, and how over many thousands rounds of replications you end up with a multi-trillion cell organism. That is development, and it is growth. Single cell organisms also grow, so we see this in all kinds of organisms. The last one that I listed on your study guide is heredity. And I included this, even though it's not necessarily in your textbook, but the ability to pass your genes onto the next generation is a critical part of life. So I added that as an eighth one. Now on your own, I want you to think about this. Are there organisms that you can think of that have all 8 of these properties? Are there organisms that lack all 8 or lack a subset of these properties of life? And we'll talk about that in class tomorrow or on Wednesday. The next thing I want to talk about are those levels of organization. I want to begin with the level at the cell. We know that all living organisms have one or more cells. The levels of organization below the cell are not living. Everything above the cell is living. So we know within this cell we have organelles. So maybe we'll have a mitochondria that I'll draw like this. Maybe we'll have a nucleus inside the cell. These organelles are themselves not living. By themselves, they wouldn't survive. But they are a level of organization below the cell. Now we'll learn that not all cells have organelles, some don't. Now what's below organelles? Molecules are below organelles, like DNA would be a molecule. Proteins, which I'm going to just draw as kind of this glob. When proteins fold up, they form these nice spherical globs. All these kinds of molecules, not just these, lipids, sugars, all that good stuff. These are all molecules, and they are essential for life. All cells have molecules, and with those molecules, these cells can survive. Now what about above the cell? Though I didn't draw this to look like a heart cell, let's just say that this is a cardiocyte, a cell from the heart. When these cells come together, they can form a tissue. And I'm going to draw a linking group of cells here, and I'm attempting to draw this layer of tissues called the myocardium. These are heart cells that come together and begin to form that functional unit of what will become the organ. But right now, it's just a tissue. And think of the tissue as this collection of cells that now work together for a common purpose. Now, these myocardial cells in the myocardium, along with other tissues of the heart, will now come together to form the actual heart. And I'm not going to be able to draw an anatomical heart, so I'm just going to draw a hallmark heart. But this organ, the heart, is a collection of the myocardium plus other tissues. So think of organs like the heart only being able to function when all of the tissues found in that organ are present. Each of those tissues perform a very special function in that organ. Now, within an organism, this heart by itself doesn't function all alone. It's going to require other parts of the cardiovascular system. So if I were to draw my poor impression of what an anatomical heart would actually look like, you can think of that as your heart. Now, extending away from the heart, we would have various arteries, and moving into the heart, we would have other vessels called veins. And as these vessels travel throughout the organism, they will interact with other tissues. All the blood vessels and the heart itself go on to form the cardiovascular, and I'm just going to put CV system. So organ systems are composed of several different organs that all have a common purpose, a common goal for that organism. Now, all of these organ systems, we just showed this cardiovascular system, but remember there's also the reproductive system, the digestive system, the respiratory system. All of these systems have to ultimately work together for the entire organism. Now, of course, I'm drawing a human here, but recognize this is true for all multicellular organisms that have various organs and organ systems. I'm going to erase this because we're not quite done. This is all you might need for a single organism to survive, but what about all the organisms that it may interact with? What's the level of organization beyond this single individual? So I'm going to draw my lovely representation of an organism here. And by itself, it's just a single organism. So let's write organism under here. Now, when you have multiple organisms of that same species together in the same area, we call that a population. So if you have several organisms, again, of the same species, it has to be the same species, there might be some variation. They may not all look the same, so we can make them look a little different, but they're all the same species. We call this a population. When we add to this population, in this case a human population, all the other species that interact with them, we then call it a community. So let's just list some species that might interact with humans. It could be other animals, it could be plants, fungi, various kinds of protozoa. All of these interact with this population, this human population, and the human population interacts with these species. And as I said before, when they interact together, we call that a community. Now, this community, including humans and all the animals, plants, fungi, protozoa, and I should have added two very important organisms, bacteria and archaea. All of these living organisms that interact with humans, as I said, they form the community, but rarely do organisms interact with each other with just living organisms. If you take this community and now we add various non-living components like water, pH, wind, pressure, all these many other non-living components that really influence how this one population survives and how it interacts with these other populations to form the community. So when you add these non-living components, which you'll learn later are called abiotic factors, but don't worry about that for now, together this will make up the ecosystem. So that ecosystem includes all the living organisms within a community plus the non-living components that interact with the living organisms. Now the last part that I want to talk about when we discuss the levels of organization is called the biosphere. Essentially, this is all of the Earth. All of the ecosystems together make up the biosphere. The last thing I want to talk about is the classification of life. We as humans often like to put things into groups of things that appear or look or act similarly. It's just kind of what we do. But as biologists, it's really important to be able to group things together that are similar. It tells us a lot about how they function. It tells us a lot about their evolution, where they came from. So it's a very important part of understanding biology. And the way we look at this classification has changed over the years. We have learned more about how to look at and classify different organisms. So what you're learning today is a little different than what I would have learned as a student a few years ago, okay, several years ago. So we can classify all of life into one of three domains. We can think of all of these organisms in these three domains as coming from one common ancestor. And I'm going to draw this in a very simple model. We'll expand this later on. But the first domain are bacteria. The second domain are archaea. You may have learned that bacteria and archaea are collectively called prokaryotes. This is an outdated term, and I would suggest that we not use that term anymore, because we now know that bacteria and archaea, even though they are less complex and single-celled organisms, we know, evolutionarily speaking, the two of them are not that similar. In fact, we know that archaea themselves are more related to this third domain that I'm going to write here called eukarya. So more similar to eukarya than bacteria. So these are the three domains: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Now the eukarya, we're going to just take a brief moment here to break that down just a little bit and talk about the different organisms found in eukarya. So we know within eukarya we have the animals, plants, fungi, and protista. Alright, that's all I have for you for this note-taking guide for day 2 that covers chapter 1 in your textbook. If you have any questions as you go through this material, please let me know and I'll be happy to help in any way I can. Good luck, and I'll see you in class. Bye.